This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Welcome to the Fatigue Fixer podcast. Have you ever wondered why you and most of the women you know seem tired so much of the time? Well, this is the podcast where we explore why. I'm here to help you better understand how your body works, whether we're talking about heavy, painful periods, why you have to pee all the time, or what the heck is happening to your body through perimenopause. And I'm not afraid to shed light on conversations that I feel we need to be having out in the open. Like, why are so many women struggling with irritability and anger, drinking more alcohol, and injecting our faces with Botox and fillers in an attempt to stay young? I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Vadeboncoeur. I'm a naturopathic doctor, mom, fatigue fixer, and loud and outspoken woman who's fascinated by the state of modern women's health and well-being. I know that you, yes, you, are incredible, and I want you to have the energy you need to share your unique gifts with the world because we are in desperate need of more female leadership. So join me for conversations that will help you feel less alone, more informed about all the things that might be draining your energy, and inspired to fix your fatigue and wake up every morning feeling rested and excited for the day ahead. I can't wait to share today's episode with you, so let's get into it. Welcome back. Today we're talking about something that is flooding my Instagram feed right now, which is menopause. Menopause is having a moment, and I'm so glad that we're finally having open and honest conversations about this major hormonal milestone that every woman will go through if she lives long enough. But like all things that have their social media moment, sometimes all that information is just making us more confused. In fact, a report by the Menopause Foundation of Canada reports that less than 25% of women believe that they are very knowledgeable about the signs and symptoms of perimenopause and menopause. So my goal today is to help change that by helping you understand the 4 to 10 year journey that is perimenopause. Yes, you heard me correctly. It can last up to a decade. So you need to know what it is, what to expect, and most importantly, what you can do to not make it suck so much. Let's start by getting really clear on what perimenopause is. So I like to use a running analogy to describe menopause. For anyone who's ever run a marathon, you might understand this analogy. So premenopause is like your training. So premenopause is basically most of your adult life where you're getting a regular cycle. You're basically preparing for the big event. Your period is showing up every month around the same time, and you're still fertile, right? You can still get pregnant. Perimenopause is like running a marathon. Number one, it's long. Like I said, on average, it lasts 4 years, but it can last up to 10 years. And it's also like a marathon because it's freaking hard. And we'll get into all the nitty-gritty about all the changes that are happening and what those feel like. But in perimenopause, your period is not as regular anymore because you're starting to run out of eggs. And this causes major hormonal fluctuations and changes. You can still technically get pregnant, but your fertile window is definitely closing very quickly. And then menopause is the finish line. It's basically one day after your 4 to 10 years of hormonal changes, you cross the finish line, and you get to cross the finish line because you did it. You had an average probably of about 480 periods, and now you're done. So menopause is basically a date. It is the date where you have had no bleeding for an entire year. Hooray! That is the sign that you are in menopause. You are now out of viable eggs. You are no longer fertile. And the prize you get for running this long marathon is no more periods. So you get to throw out your pads and your tampons and throw your party because you're done. And then basically every day forward from that day is post-menopause. So basically the rest of your life after you stop bleeding is post-menopause. So a lot of times when we're throwing around the word menopause and we're talking about symptoms, we're often actually talking about perimenopause, because perimenopause is where most women start to notice changes. And again, menopause is really just the finish line. It's the 1-year date of I haven't had any bleeding. One of the things that is very common that I hear in my office from my patients, and often they've been told this by their family doctors, is, but aren't I too young to be in perimenopause? Well, let's do some math and help you find out. So the average age of menopause, which again is the day where you have no periods for a year, the average age for that in Canada and the US is about 51 or 52. But it's normal to go through menopause anywhere between ages 45 and 55. And since perimenopause can start as early as 10 years before menopause, it can start as early as 35 years old. I know, it doesn't feel fair that you might literally just have gone through early motherhood and you're finally starting to feel human again. And your body's like, just kidding, here's perimenopause. The joys of being a woman sometimes. So we know that about 20% of women are in perimenopause at age 40. So you're probably not too young to be in perimenopause. And all women will enter perimenopause at some point in their 40s. The number one predictor of when you will go through menopause, so again, not when you'll start perimenopause, but when your periods will end, the number one predictor of that is your genetics. So if your mom is still around, it's a great question to ask her. If you have sisters, ask them, what age were you when your periods stopped? Because that is the best predictor we have for when your periods will stop. And then again, perimenopause will be the 4 to 10 years before that. So when we look at what's normal, again, it's normal to stop your periods anywhere between ages 45 to 55. If you stop your periods before the age of 45, we consider that early menopause. And if you stop your periods before the age of 40, we consider that to be premature menopause. And often with premature menopause, it's caused by something called POI, which stands for premature ovarian insufficiency, which is basically where the ovaries run out of eggs much sooner than we would expect. And there often will be some kind of underlying autoimmune condition that might be contributing to that. It's really important because especially if you go through your menopause early before the age of 45, or especially if you go before the age of 40, you're going to be at increased risk for some of the conditions that are associated with low levels of estrogen, because basically your hormones are going to drop much sooner than the average woman. And so you're going to be at increased risk for things like osteoporosis and bone fractures. So if you went through menopause or you're going through menopause before the age of 45, I really encourage you to have a conversation with your practitioner about hormone replacement therapy, because that is often strongly indicated for people who go through menopause early to help offset some of these increased risks. Let's talk about what is actually happening in perimenopause. So what's happening in this 4 to 10 year window? The first stage is your early perimenopause, and this can last a variety of different lengths. So for some women, it's a couple years. For some women, it's many, many years. And basically, early perimenopause is when your menstrual cycle starts to change by more than 7 days. So for example, if you are a 30-day cycle, your period shows up every 30 days, and then all of a sudden you get a period after 21 days, or you get a cycle that's 40 days. If your period shows up more than 7 days, either too early or too late from what you're typically used to, if that happens at least twice, it doesn't have to be 2 cycles in a row, but if you have at least 2 cycles that are off by 1 week, you are most likely in perimenopause. That is the official way that we tell you you're in perimenopause, is you have at least, again, 2 periods that are showing up a week different than what you're used to. One of the things that a lot of women wonder if they have a period that is off, they'll wonder if it's maybe due to stress. If you're over the age of 40, it is very unlikely that stress is going to be what changes your cycle, because at that point, your cycle is very entrenched. It's most likely perimenopause, but we still want to make sure that we're looking for other causes, in particular thyroid disorders and diabetes. But the most likely reason that your periods are starting to change if you're over 40 is perimenopause. The important thing to know about early perimenopause is that at this stage, hot flashes and night sweats are not likely. But there are lots of other symptoms that you might notice, like mood changes, increased depression, heavier periods, your sleep is disrupted. These are all very, very common. And in fact, up to 70% of women report depressive symptoms during perimenopause. And that's compared to 30% in premenopause. So there's a huge rise in mood changes during this phase of life. And part of that is because we have hormone receptors all over our body and in our brain. So when hormone levels start to change, we can often feel that in all kinds of different places. And a lot of women don't realize that their symptoms are due to perimenopause because they're not having hot flashes or night sweats, or their periods haven't changed that much. So they don't realize that what they're experiencing is perimenopause. And then late perimenopause, that lasts for somewhere between 1 and 3 years. And this is where your cycles start to become more irregular, and you're going to go 60 days or more between your periods. So you're starting to skip periods or having months without any periods. That means you're moving into the later stages of perimenopause. So you're getting into the later stages of that race. You're getting kind of closer to the finish line. And this is where the hot flashes and night sweats are very likely to start, is usually in this later phase of perimenopause. Again, once you have had 0 periods for a year, you are officially in menopause. Congratulations. The 1 to 2 years after your final period is called your early post-menopause. This is actually where hot flashes and night sweats are the most likely. And then once you have been more than 6 years without a period, you are now in your late post-menopause. And this is where we really often start to see worsening symptoms of vaginal changes and bladder changes. And we're going to do a whole episode on sex and vaginal health. So please stay tuned for more on this, because it's very common. And again, it's another thing that we normalize, that women's vaginas just dry up as we get older. And it's really important to treat that. So we're going to do a whole episode about it. To answer the big question, if you're listening and you're like, okay, so how do I know if I'm in perimenopause? You need to track your cycles. And if you're seeing that your period is showing up a week either too early or too late compared to what you're used to, you are in perimenopause. One of the things that everyone wants to know, is there a test? Can we test my hormones? Can we test to see if I'm in perimenopause? The short answer is no. There is no good test to tell you whether or not you're in perimenopause, because it is not a diagnosis we make based on hormone levels. It is a clinical diagnosis, meaning we make it based on your symptoms and what's happening with your periods. And part of why testing is not very helpful is that the hormone that we normally check, which is FSH, stands for follicular stimulating hormone. If you were to test that in early perimenopause, that hormone is changing all the time. So just because you have it tested and it's high one day doesn't mean it's not going to be normal the next day. So because it's changing all the time, testing is absolutely useless. And even if it is high, it doesn't tell us anything more than just paying attention to your symptoms and your period. When you're in late perimenopause, we will start to see this hormone again, the follicular stimulating hormone. We will start to see it go up, but again, it's not diagnostic. The way that you know you're in perimenopause is that, again, you have at least 2 periods that showed up a week or more from what you're used to, and maybe you have other symptoms. And then we'll know that you're in menopause when you have had 0 periods for a year. Now, if you have an IUD, if you've had a hysterectomy or you've had an ablation, it's a little bit trickier because if you don't have a bleeding pattern, it's really hard to tell because we don't have the period to tell us. We can still make an educated guess based on your age and based on your symptoms. And that is a case where sometimes we will use blood work just as a kind of another piece of the puzzle. But there is no test that's going to give you a definitive yes or no. And this is something I see where women will go see their family doctor. They're wondering about perimenopause. They get sent for hormone testing. The hormone testing comes back normal, and they're told you're not in perimenopause. And again, there's no hormone testing that can tell you whether or not you're in perimenopause. I know I'm like beating this point to death, but the reason is that there are a lot of practitioners right now selling and recommending all kinds of different hormone tests. Some are very expensive, which women are buying because they're just trying to understand what's going on with them. And those tests are just not helpful. They don't help us they don't help us know whether or not you're in perimenopause, and they also don't help us treat you better. Because the other thing that is often confusing for women is that we don't need to know your actual hormone levels in order to get you good treatment for your perimenopause. Again, we can do that by just doing a good history and looking at your symptoms. Maybe you're like, my period is still really normal, but I'm noticing some changes. What is that about? A lot of hormone changes will start before your period changes. So again, technically, you're not in perimenopause until you get some period changes. But in the late part of your premenopause, you are way more likely to start having worsening PMS. This is probably one of the most common things that women come in for. They're like, I am so bitchy before my period. I'm so grumpy. I'm yelling at my kids. My husband has to run and hide. Like, it's really bad. So this is very common that we're going to see the mood start to change before the period changes. And a lot of women find that they start to sleep more poorly. So a classic kind of hormonal insomnia is that you fall asleep easily because you're so friggin' exhausted, but then you're wide awake somewhere between 1 and 3 and you have no idea why, and then you struggle to get back to sleep. So if that is starting to happen, you're probably moving towards perimenopause, even if you aren't officially in perimenopause yet. Let's chat about what's actually happening to your hormones. What is happening to your hormones when all of this is going down? So again, when we look at early perimenopause, you're going to start to have some months where you're not ovulating, or if you do, you're not making the same amount of progesterone that you would have when you were, let's say, 20 or 25, because the eggs that you have left by the time you're in your 40s, they're not such great quality. And part of that is because your eggs have been with you since birth. Every drunken McDonald's run, every vodka cranberry that you drank in university, your eggs were there for that. So our eggs over time, and certainly depending on our lifestyle, the quality and the health of those eggs by the time we're in our 40s is not great. And so if our eggs are not great and we're starting to run out of eggs, that has a huge impact on how much hormone we're producing every month when we ovulate. And one of the first things that we'll start to see with perimenopause, especially in the early stages, is that your progesterone levels start to drop. The thing you need to know about progesterone is it's basically like a natural anti-anxiety hormone that we make every month. And so when progesterone levels start to drop, a lot of women start to feel more anxious. They often will find that they're not sleeping well, and they might even start having night sweats. In the early stages of perimenopause, your estrogen levels are still high, and they're variable. They're probably up and down throughout your cycle. And so this is where a lot of people have come up with this idea or this term of estrogen dominance, where you supposedly have too much estrogen and not enough progesterone. And so we often see estrogen dominance being blamed for a lot of the symptoms of perimenopause. But I need you to understand that your symptoms are not caused by high estrogen. you are going to know when estrogen drops. That is when you're going to start having symptoms. Most of us feel really good in the parts of our cycle where there are high levels of estrogen. This idea that high estrogen is what's making us feel bad is completely unfounded. So please don't worry about estrogen dominance or having too much estrogen. Just be happy that you still are making good amounts of estrogen at this stage of your perimenopause. What is causing some of the symptoms are the rapid fluctuations and the rapid changes in your hormone levels. And especially when there's a big drop in hormones, that is where we're typically not going to feel very good. And those big drops of hormones are very common, and they're more abrupt and more severe in perimenopause. When you get to the later stages of perimenopause, this is where you really start running out of eggs. At this point, you're only ovulating 50% of the time in the last couple of years before menopause. So your progesterone levels really start tanking. And now estrogen is also starting to drop, especially when you're having cycles that are longer than 60 days. So if you haven't had a period in a couple months, you're very likely starting to have low levels of estrogen. And this is when you're much more likely to start to get the more classic symptoms of perimenopause. Things like hot flashes, night sweats, vaginal dryness. These are all symptoms of low estrogen. And then on top of all of those hormonal changes, this can make you feel really tired. There's often mental fatigue because we become really forgetful. So we're finding that we have to write everything down so we don't forget it. A lot of times we're worrying about our weight because we're noticing that our body is changing in ways we don't like. We're going to also do a whole episode on weight and metabolic changes that happen in your 40s and beyond. So stay tuned if you want to hear more about that. We're often dealing with emotional fatigue because our mood is changing. We're irritable, we're depressed, we're impatient, and we've got raging PMS. And then we're physically exhausted because we're not sleeping well. And then we're often iron deficient because our periods are coming more often. And when they do show up, they're often really heavy. All of this means that 1 in 10 women are going to leave the workforce because they cannot manage their symptoms properly. And this is something that I find just unacceptable, that in this day and age that we have women who are leaving the workforce because they are not getting the care and support they need to manage their symptoms. On top of all of that, you've also got your period, which might be a hot mess. So I want you to know that it is completely normal to have irregular periods during perimenopause. That is part of the process. There's nothing wrong if your periods are irregular. That is just part of you running out of eggs and moving towards no periods at all. So what a lot of women notice is that in the beginning, their cycles often start out by getting a little bit shorter. So if you're a 28-day cycle kind of girl, you might notice that now it's 27 and 26 and 25 days, and now it's 24, and eventually it might be 21. So often your periods will start coming a little bit closer together. You can even get 2 periods in 1 month. It's called a loop cycle. Super fun. And then eventually, as you go into your later perimenopause, this is where your periods start to become more irregular. And this is where you'll often go longer stretches, often months without your period, until you finally have a whole year with no bleeding. And then again, you are officially in menopause. The other thing that's very common during perimenopause, which I talked about in episode 1, are heavy periods. And there's several reasons why you might get heavier periods in perimenopause. The most likely reason is because of the hormonal changes. So because, especially in the beginning, progesterone levels are dropping and estrogen levels are still high, that can cause the lining of your uterus to get thicker. And that is what you're shedding every month. So the thicker the lining, the heavier your period is going to be. And then a lot of women in their 40s also start to develop things like fibroids or polyps or adenomyosis. These are all conditions that happen inside the uterus that can absolutely have an impact on how heavy your periods are. It's really important that we treat these heavy periods because, again, they have such a huge impact on how we feel. So if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, what can I do? What do I do with all this information, Dr. Sarah? The first thing you can do, if you're not already doing it, is to start tracking your cycle and your symptoms. I want you to either use a period tracking app or a good old pen and paper and just start writing down when you get your period, how long it lasts, and start to make note of any symptoms that you're experiencing. This is really helpful because when you go see your doctor or your naturopathic doctor, you have some information to present them with. And a lot of times, if your symptoms are hormonally related, they're going to follow a certain pattern where often they're going to get worse right before your period and during your period. So for example, I've started to notice this with my sleep. My sleep is a lot worse in the few days before I get my period. And I'm going to have usually at least one night where I'm going to wake up in a night sweat. So by tracking it, I was able to see that the sleep issues that I'm dealing with right now are mostly hormonal because they're really happening only at a certain part of my cycle. And the rest of the time, I'm sleeping really well. So tracking your symptoms really helps us to understand whether or not they're hormonal or whether they might be due to something else. The other thing is to just really focus on all the healthy habits you already know are important. There are lots of things that we want to do that are specific to perimenopause, but there's lots of things that are just the basic things that make a huge difference, right? Getting enough sleep, eating healthy food, drinking enough water, managing your stress and exercise. The more consistent you can be with some of these basic behaviors, the better it's going to be to help you kind of get through your perimenopause experience. And then if and when you do have symptoms, whether it's mood changes, PMS, hot flashes, night sweats, vaginal changes, we have lots of safe and effective treatments. So starting with your nutrition and supplements, these can be really helpful for managing some of the mood, memory, and energy changes, as well as the worsening PMS symptoms. Antidepressants can be very helpful, especially if you're struggling with depression and major mood changes. And what's really interesting is that if you are going through perimenopause, combining hormone replacement therapy with antidepressants seems to be especially helpful for treating some of the mood changes that happen because, again, the mood changes are in large part driven by what's happening with your hormones. And then obviously we have HRT or hormone replacement therapy, and this can be really helpful for treating things like hot flashes, night sweats, sleep disruptions, vaginal dryness, bladder changes. Like I said, it can reduce your risk for osteoporosis. So obviously, we're not doing a whole episode right now on HRT. You can go back to season 1 and listen to the episode that I did with Dr. Ardell Piper, the one where your period stops. We did a much deeper dive on hormone replacement therapy if you want to learn more about that. But some of the common myths that are still circulating, number one is that you have to wait until you're in menopause to start hormone replacement therapy. That is 100% false, especially when we're looking at helping mood changes. We know that HRT is way more effective if we started during perimenopause than if we wait for menopause. And we also know that hormone replacement therapy is very helpful for helping to offset bone loss and helping to reduce the risk of osteoporosis. And women lose an enormous amount of bone in the 3-year window that surrounds their last menstrual period. So again, if you're waiting until after your period stops to start hormone replacement therapy, you've potentially missed out on that critical window. So you absolutely can start hormone replacement therapy in perimenopause. You do not need to wait until your period is gone. We also have things that can help manage some of the heavy bleeding, like we talked about. IUDs, we have birth control, we have uterine ablation and hysterectomy. And then we also know that things like cognitive behavioral therapy and hypnotherapy can also be really helpful to help with mood changes and hot flashes. So again, we have a variety of different treatments that are available to us. It's really important for you to know that the gold standard treatment for the symptoms of perimenopause and menopause is hormone replacement therapy. That doesn't mean it's for everybody, but certainly for most women, it is a very safe and effective treatment. And again, if you want to hear more about that, go back to season 1. I think it's episode 5, the one where your period stops. Perimenopause is a time of massive hormonal changes. And that's often why we don't feel so great during our 40s, because we are going through this massive hormonal change. But I really want you to know that it doesn't mean that you just have to suffer through it. It can actually be a great opportunity to reprioritize yourself and your health. I love working with women in their 40s because I really feel like a lot of women go through this awakening when they go through their 40s, where they realize that they're no longer going to tolerate and accept putting themselves and their health on the back burner. And they're really ready to prioritize themselves, to take care of their health. And they're really one of the amazing things is that because we are talking more about menopause and perimenopause, women are more proactive about wanting to do whatever they can to support themselves through this phase. And they're actually asking their doctors about HRT, which I think is fantastic. So I think our 40s can be such a powerful decade to really start or build on habits that not only are going to help you thrive through your perimenopause, but they're going to help keep us healthy and strong so that we're still living the lives we want in our 80s. One of the things that I've really prioritized since I turned 40 is focusing on building muscle and lifting weights. We're also going to do an episode on that, so stay tuned. That's one of the most powerful things that we can do for ourselves as we're going through our perimenopause transition. So perimenopause, it's no walk in the park. It is like running the marathon, which many of us don't want to do. But if we're lucky to live long enough, we're going to have to go through it. And can we see it as an opportunity where our bodies and our minds and our hormones are shifting away from reproduction being the main goal, and they're shifting towards this post-fertile era where we can focus on creating whatever we want for ourselves in the next decade of our lives. There's no reason that we need to suffer unnecessarily through perimenopause. We have so many safe and effective therapies that can help us manage the symptoms so that we can make our 40s our best decade yet. It really doesn't need to be a disaster. If you want to more fully understand what the heck is happening to your hormones in your 40s, you can check out my 40 and Fatigued Masterclass, which I'll link in the show notes. This is one of my most popular masterclasses. It's basically your perimenopause 101 crash course so that you can understand what's happening to your hormones. And so basically you can more confidently care for your changing hormones and your changing body. And if you live in Ontario and you want to become a patient, you can book an appointment with me by visiting my website, www.drsarahv.ca. So perimenopause often starts sooner than you think. I'm 41 and I've already started to have some night sweats. So it's never too early to start paying attention to your cycle and your hormonal symptoms. Join me in a couple of weeks for our next episode all about how perimenopause and menopause impact our vaginal health and our sexual function. No topic is off limits here on the Fatigue Fixer. Hope you'll join me then. Talk soon. Thanks for spending your precious time with me today. If you enjoyed today's episode, it would mean so much to me if you would take a moment to leave us a rating and review, and share this episode with a friend who needs to hear it. If you're ready to get more insight into what's making you tired, find out which of the 5 most common types of fatigue you're dealing with by taking my fatigue fingerprint quiz at fatiguefixer.ca/quiz. Are you dealing with frazzled fatigue, where your body's exhausted but your brain won't shut up? Or maybe you're more of the drained fatigue type, where no matter how much sleep you get, you struggle to get up in the morning. Just take my fatigue fingerprint quiz and you'll have more insight into which labs to ask your doctor for and what habits and practices are best for fixing your type of fatigue. Find the quiz at fatiguefixer.ca/quiz. Because let's face it, accepting perpetual exhaustion as the norm, that's just not going to fly around here. Last but not least, I want to thank Jen Hudson and Mike Trutler over at Story Studio Network for bringing these conversations to life. I'll see you right back here in 2 weeks. Bye.